A Navy SEAL swallowed by a Montana blizzard stood alone on a road of ice, his truck a cold, dead shell, his breath a pale ghost in the dark. He cradled 2 tiny German Shepherd puppies wrapped in a blanket, their fragile lives flickering like the last ember of a fire. No one belonged out in this storm. But then, headlights sliced through the storm. A red pickup slowed beside him. Behind the wheel, an old veteran with weary eyes lowered his window and said gently, "Get in, son. No one survives this kind of cold alone." What followed was more than a rescue. It became a miracle that healed 2 broken men and the fragile lives they carried. Before this story continues, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. Snow fell in a crushing silence over the Montana mountains, a curtain of white blurring the earth from the sky. The forest, on each side of the narrow road, sagged heavy beneath the impossible weight of winter. Its pines whispered on the wind like tired sentinels. The air was sharp enough to burn the lungs, and the cold bit through layers of fabric and human resolve. Somewhere in that frozen, desolate wilderness, a man walked alone, his breath a ghostly cloud against the dark. Luke Tanner moved slowly on, his boots crunching through snowdrifts reaching his calves. His truck had died over a mile back. An old engine that coughed just once, sputtered, then gave up completely. He sat in the silence for a while, hoping it might somehow start again. But when the cab's temperature dropped until his own breath felt heavy, he'd stepped out cradling the only warmth he had left to protect. 2 German Shepherd puppies wrapped tightly in a wool blanket and held close against his chest, abandoned by the roadside in a wooden crate, their fur already stiff with the encroaching frost. They were barely more than 6 weeks old, the smaller one a black and tan with soft ears that refused to stand, whimpered occasionally, while the other, a little larger with golden streaks on its paws, had gone unnervingly still. Luke had seen that exact kind of stillness before, the razor's edge between surrender and survival. He kept walking, his breathing becoming shallow, the weight of the puppies pulling at his exhausted arms. His face, etched by years of hard discipline, now bore the quiet desperation of a man who had faced worse storms. But those weren't made of snow. At 38, Luke Tanner still looked like the soldier he once was. Tall, broad-shouldered, his dark hair trimmed down close, dark with faint threads of gray at the temples. His steel blue eyes, distant, held an exhaustion not born from the miles he had walked, but from memories that refused to die. He had once been a Navy SEAL, the kind of soldier sent where others never returned from. The war had carved away pieces of his soul, some visible, others not. Since leaving the service 2 years ago, he lived quietly, drifting from job to job, state after state, never staying long enough for a single soul to remember his name. Tonight he was meant to be heading north toward a temporary contract near Kalispell. Instead, he was stranded in a blizzard shadows of his past, trailing him as relentlessly as his own footsteps. A brutal gust of wind tore across the road, nearly sending him sideways. He tightened the blanket around the puppies, whispering into the storm, "Hang in there, little ones. Don't you give up on me." A faint smile touched his lips at the madness of it all. But hearing his own voice was a stark reminder that he was still fighting. Through the curtain of blinding white, a faint light glimmered orange and unwavering, and moving. His heart pounded. Headlights. He threw his free arm up, stumbling on, his voice cracking against the wind's roar. "Hey, over here!" The red glow intensified until a pickup truck materialized from the blizzard, its engine rumbling low. It slowed as it approached, tires crunching on the ice before stopping just feet away. The door opened, and a man stepped out into the cold. Thomas Reed was built like a man who'd spent a lifetime staring down storms and conflicts. He was in his mid-50s. His frame was solid but weary, his motions intentional, not slow, just careful. Short gray hair poked out from beneath a dark wool cap, and a heavy coat was draped over his broad shoulders. A short, silver-streaked beard framed a face that was both stern and kind, one that commanded respect without a single word. His pale blue eyes, piercing but steady, measured Luke for a moment before he spoke. "You stranded, son?" His voice was heavy with gravel and time. Luke nodded, moving into the headlight's glare.
Bethom.
Truck died a ways back. Been walking for a while. He adjusted the blanket, revealing the two small pups. Found them back there. Couldn't just leave them. Thomas's brow furrowed. Hell of a night to be a hero. He stepped closer, squinting through the snow. You military? Luke hesitated, then gave a short, firm nod. Used to be a Navy SEAL. Thomas's expression softened, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Used to be? He repeated softly. Yeah, I know that feeling. The wind howled, whipping stinging ice between them. Thomas glanced to the sky, then back at Luke. This storm's getting worse. You'll freeze to death out here if you keep going. Luke adjusted his hold on the puppies. I just need to find shelter. Maybe a gas station. Nothing for miles. Thomas interrupted, his tone firm but not harsh. Got a cabin up the road. 5 minutes if we're lucky. One. You can wait out the storm there. Luke hesitated. His training had taught him to be cautious, even when help appeared kind. But Thomas just stood there steady and unflinching in the cold, reminded him of the men he once trusted with his very life. The kind who were quiet because everything important had already been said in places that offered no second chances. Finally, Luke complied. All right, and I would appreciate that. Thomas motioned to the truck. Get in. Keep those pups near the vent. They'll need the heat more than us. As Luke climbed inside, he caught the faint scent of coffee and motor oil. It was a strange sort of comfort. The cab was warm, the heater humming while the wipers carved out slow, steady arcs through the falling snow. Beneath the blanket, the puppies stirred, pushing their small noses toward the warmth. Thomas pulled the door shut, cutting off the storm. Name's Thomas Reed, he grunted, shifting into gear. Army? Iraq. Back when the sand still meant something. Luke stole a glance, surprised by the man's directness. Guess that makes two of us, Luke murmured. Survivors of bad calls. Thomas let out a low, humorless chuckle, a sound born from memory. Ain't that the damn truth? They drove on in a heavy silence for a while. The only sounds the engine's deep rumble and the wind groaning against the glass. The snow outside thickened, but the warmth was beginning to finally thaw the deep ache from Luke's hands. Thomas finally broke the silence, his voice softer now. That uniform, he began. Been a while since I saw one out here. You coming from somewhere or running from it? Luke just watched the snow streak past the window. A little of both, he admitted. Thomas gave a slow, knowing nod, understanding everything that wasn't said. Yeah, the road's full of men like that, he said. Still walking just 'cause they forgot how to stop. Luke offered no reply, just tightened his grip on the blanket. The puppies shifted underneath, their small bodies burrowing closer. A few silent minutes later, Thomas veered the truck off the main road. He steered them down a narrow lane, walls of snow-heavy trees on either side. Then, a faint yellow glow. It flickered through the swirling snow. That's the cabin, he said. Solid roof. Fire's likely still warm. As they entered the clearing, the snow was coming down harder now, the flakes dancing like ghosts in the headlights. Thomas killed the lights, but left the engine running. He turned to Luke. You're staying. The roads will be gone by morning. Luke opened his mouth to protest, but Thomas's tone was iron, leaving no room for argument. That wasn't a request, son. Nobody makes it through this alone. Luke let out a slow breath, the fight finally draining from him. Thank you, he breathed. They faced the onslaught of the storm together. The red taillights bled across the snow in shades of crimson, a stark glow against the blackness of the trees. Thomas pushed toward the cabin door. As Luke stood frozen by the truck, the puppies sheltered securely in his arms. Their tiny eyes blinked in the crimson glow, two small embers of life flickering against the frozen darkness. Thomas looked back, his voice a low command carried on the wind. Get in here before this storm buries us both. Luke obeyed, his boots crunching through the ever-deepening snow. The wind howled around them, yet for a heartbeat, the world seemed to fall silent. In the fading glow of the taillights, two men, both forged in silent battles few could ever comprehend, faced each other in the heart of the storm. Their breath clouded the air, their eyes heavy with a shared weariness and a glimmer of understanding. The snow fell relentlessly, burying the road behind them, erasing the line where one man's lonely path had finally met another's. The fire's red glow danced again on their faces, and in that fleeting light, the two German shepherd pups stirred their small eyes, mirroring what little warmth the world had left. Like a stubborn flame against the gale, the storm showed no mercy. The wind howled around the cabin's frame, shrieking through every crack in the old wood as if to test its very endurance. Snowdrifts consumed the porch, erasing the road they'd traveled, until the world was just a swirl of white past the frosted panes. Inside, though, a fragile sanctuary of warmth had begun to form. The fire Thomas built in the stone hearth hissed softly as it consumed the logs, casting a flickering amber light on walls lined with old photos and hunting gear. Luke sat cross-legged on a worn rug, the two pups bundled in a wool blanket by the fire. The heat was working. Their fur began to steam faintly, the dampness vanishing in the glow. The smaller pup, black and tan, alert yet timid, had stopped its trembling and pressed its nose into Luke's hand. The other, golden-pawed and restless, tried to squirm free. "Easy there, little guy," Luke murmured. "You've got more fight than most soldiers I've known." The words held a half-smile that died long before it could reach his eyes. Thomas watched from the kitchen corner, boiling water on an old gas stove. His movements were slow but deliberate, honed by years of solitude. The man's back was broad, his shoulders suggesting both resilience and deep weariness. The faint scars on his knuckles told of a life that wasn't gentle. "Coffee's ready in a minute," he said, his voice a gravelly sound from disuse. "Ain't much, but it'll keep the chill out of your bones." Luke nodded, not looking up. "I'll take anything hot," he said, eyes on the pups. Thomas poured 2 cups and brought them over. The mugs were a mismatched pair. One had a chipped rim, the other a dull military-issue tin. But the smell of roasted beans filled the room, a memory of civilization. As they drank, silence stretched out between them. Not awkward, but weighted like 2 men measuring the distance between their own ghosts. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, the fire snapped and whispered. Thomas was the first to speak. "You said you were Navy." He began, his tone casual, but probing. "How long were you in—" 15 years, Luke said, staring into the fire. "Got out 6 months ago." 15, Thomas repeated, letting out a soft whistle. "That's a lifetime for some." Luke didn't answer right away. His fingers traced the mug's edge absently, his eyes unfocused. "Feels longer," he finally said. "Last deployment went south. Lost my partner, my fault. Maybe, maybe not. Doesn't matter now." Thomas just studied him quietly. The younger man's words had the flat tone of someone burying pain under discipline. He'd heard it before in hospitals, bars, and in the mirror. "What was his name?" Clear's throat. "Carter Hayes." Luke said, his voice just barely a whisper. "We'd served together since our first tour. He was the kind of guy who could find a joke even when hell was on fire. Our mission was a routine recon, or so they told us. We walked right into a kill zone. He never made it back. But I did." Luke stared down at his hands, the scars stark against his skin. "They pinned a medal on my chest. I was gone by the next week." A knowing softness filled Thomas's eyes. He sank into the old armchair, the leather groaning quietly beneath his weight. "A piece of metal doesn't mean a thing when the one who deserved it can't be here to wear it," he murmured. Luke met his gaze, stunned by how deeply the words hit. "You sound like you know." Thomas let out a hollow chuckle. "Iraq 03. Wasted years paving roads to nowhere, watching kids age quicker in a war zone than we ever did. I came home to a world that had forgotten I existed." His gaze drifted to the mantel, to a single framed photograph resting there. It showed a woman with auburn hair and kind, weary eyes smiling beautifully into the sunlight. "That's my wife, Sarah," he said gently, catching Luke's stare. "We lost her to cancer 8 years ago. The doctors said it was early, but they were wrong. By the time we truly knew she was gone, I've stayed here ever since. Figured I was done with all the noise. The weight of his words settled between them, a heavy but honest silence. Luke gave a slow nod. "I'm sorry," he breathed, and he meant it. Thomas waved a hand. "Don't be. Life takes its due. All you can do is tend the flame that's left." The smallest puppy let out a yawn, stretching its tiny paws toward the fire's warmth. A soft chuckle escaped Thomas. "Looks like I'm not the only one needing the heat tonight. Have you named them yet?" Luke shook his head. "Not yet. I wasn't sure they were going to pull through." "Well," Thomas said, leaning in, "that bold little one, he looks like a scout to me, always rushing forward without a second thought." He gestured to the golden pup, which was now trying to scale Luke's leg. "And the quiet one, he's got eyes like an echo staring deep and soft. We'll call him Echo." A true smile finally touched Luke's face. "Scout and Echo," he repeated softly. "Yeah, that fits." The names seemed to calm the very air in the small cabin. A place once filled with the wind's lonely cry now held the quiet tapping of tiny paws on the worn wooden floor, and the faint bark so soft it felt like a memory. Thomas laughed quietly as Scout tugged at the lace of his boot. The sound seemed to startle even him. Clear his throat. "Well, would you look at that?" he murmured, shaking his head slowly. "I haven't let out a laugh like that in years." Luke just watched him, realizing how rare and precious that simple warmth was. "Guess they're good medicine for the both of us." The hours passed like a slow tide. They ate canned stew, warmed over the hearth, and shared the parts of their stories that had long been kept in the dark. Thomas talked of his years as a mechanic after the service, breathing life back into old farm trucks for ranchers still holding on. He mentioned his neighbor Martha Jennings, an old woman who would stop by with fresh pie and the latest town chatter, though he always acted too busy for it. "The truth is," he admitted, "she's what keeps me tied to this world." Luke found himself talking more than he had in years, about drifting from town to town since he left the service, just trying to find the quiet place that didn't echo with commands. "You ever find it?" Thomas asked gently. Luke stared into the flames, the fire dancing in his eyes. "Not yet," he said, "but I'm still walking." The storm raged with the deepening night. Wind battered the cabin's walls, which groaned under the assault, but held their ground. Thomas tossed a log onto the fire sparks, erupting before fading to embers. "You'll stay the night," he declared, his voice firm. "Storm's just getting meaner." Luke nodded. "I wasn't planning to argue." Thomas offered a slight, knowing grin. "Good. My wife used to say I don't win arguments. I simply outlast my opponent." The firelight flickered on their faces. An old soldier and a young one, both carrying scars too profound for the biting cold to find. Echo and Scout lay curled together on the rug, their small bodies rising and falling in a steady, unified breath. Twin rhythms of fragile existence. Outside, the gale howled violently, shaking the window panes. Inside, the fire burned steady, wrapping them both in its comforting glow. Thomas leaned back deep into his chair, his voice low yet certain. "You know, Luke," he mused, his eyes on the flames, "sometimes God sends lost souls to our door, just to remind us the road home is still there." Luke offered no reply, but his gaze softened. The puppies shifted in their sleep, their tiny paws twitching with unseen dreams. For the first time in ages, Luke felt a strange sense of peace settle in. Not the quiet of isolation, but the comfort of company on a night that should have broken them. The dawn broke slowly, like a whispered secret from the woods. The storm had finally passed, leaving a hush, leaving in its wake a world blanketed in silver silence. Snow clung to every branch, every rooftop, every single inch of the clearing, as soft as fallen ash. The sky was a muted gray bleeding into white at the horizon. The world felt newborn and achingly fragile, pristine, yet breathing with life. Luke Tanner stood at the window, his breath clouding the pain as he gazed at the mound that was his truck. Only the faint curve of its roof and mirrors peaked above the immense white drift. Guess I'm not driving anywhere soon, he murmured. Behind him, Thomas worked at the stove, frying bacon and pouring fresh coffee. That comforting aroma filled the small cabin, mingling with the soft scent of smoke from the embers crackling in the hearth. The older man moved with a comfortable, practiced ease, a quiet rhythm born from countless solitary mornings. He glanced over his shoulder, the corners of his mouth lifting into a slight smile. "You're welcome to dig it out if you feel ambitious," he offered, "but I'd wait till spring." Luke let out a soft chuckle. "I might just take that advice." He turned his attention back to the fire, where Echo and Scout were nestled together on a folded blanket. Their fur, now dry, was a soft, fluffy cloud, and their bright eyes tracked every movement in the room with boundless curiosity. As Thomas set 2 plates on the table, Scout gave an immediate, excited yip, his tail thumping a rhythm on the wood floor. "They think everything that smells that good belongs to them," Thomas remarked, grinning. Luke took a seat, the warmth of the coffee mug seeping into his chilled fingers. He only now realized the depth of his own hunger. They ate in a comfortable silence, punctuated only by the soft clink of forks and the steady crackle of the fire. Outside, the snow was so bright, it seemed to pour pure, clean light right through the windows. The world felt cleansed in the morning's sharp light. "After we've eaten," Thomas pulled on his heavy coat, tossing Luke a spare pair of gloves. "You're not escaping your share of the work, son," he declared. "That storm left its mark. The shed's roof is nearly gone, and the path to the barn is buried deep." Luke managed a small smirk, pulling on the worn gloves. "Yes, sir." They passed the morning working shoulder to shoulder in the stark white yard, the silence broken only by the steady rhythm of an axe and the strain of their labor. The cold air stung their exposed faces, but the 2 men moved with a silent, shared resolve. Thomas's axe fell with the measured strength born of long years, splitting logs perfectly in 2. Luke's stacking was precise, his motions sharp. The work felt good, simple, and full of purpose. Each swing, each lift, each breath felt like it was melting something frozen deep inside him. Now and then the dogs would tear through the snow, their small forms almost swallowed by the deep white drifts. Echo remained cautious, staying close to Luke's boots, but Scout bounded through the powder with abandon, yapping at every snowy clump that fell from the trees. Their boundless energy drew a genuine laugh from Thomas more than once. "That one has your stubborn spirit," he remarked, gesturing toward Scout. "Figures," Luke replied softly. "The loud ones are always the ones who make it." By midday, the sun finally pierced the clouds, and the snow on the cabin roof sparkled like a field of shattered diamonds. Thomas leaned heavily on his shovel, his breath pluming in the air, his face ruddy from the biting cold. "That'll do for now," he said, his voice raspy. "Let's check the barn before it gives up and crushes my tools." The barn was an old, sturdy structure, built decades ago by Thomas's father, a carpenter, before the war claimed him. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of hay and ancient timber. Luke followed Thomas into the solemn, dim light, brushing the melting snow from his shoulders. Together, they cleared the doorway, secured a loose board, and swept the floor clean. Glancing up at the high rafters, Luke saw where the wind had ripped shingles away, leaving a gaping wound. "I can fix that," he offered, already pulling a heavy ladder into place. Thomas frowned. "You don't have to do that?" "I know," Luke cut in softly. But I want to." From his perch high above, the entire clearing opened up before him a world of snow-laden pines, the brilliant glint of sun on the frozen creek, and the small cabin below a tiny breathing thing. He drove the final nail home, then made his way down, dusting off his hands. "Good as new," he announced. Thomas gave an impressed nod. "You handle yourself like you've done this before." Luke just shrugged. "It's amazing what you learn patching holes in far more broken places than this." A quiet, shared laugh passed between them. The very air in the old barn seemed to lighten. Later that same afternoon, they turned their attention to the storage shed next to the barn. Thomas creaked the door open, revealing a history of old crates, rusted tools, and forgotten boxes. Most of this was my father's. He admitted, his voice softer now. I always say I'll get around to sorting it one day. Luke knelt by a pile of weathered boxes, wiping away a thick layer of dust. Mind if I help? Be my guest. Just watch your step. Half these floorboards are older than I am. For the next hour, they worked sorting through the old tools, saving what was still useful. All the while, Echo and Scout nosed into every last forgotten corner. Their noses twitched tails, stirring up clouds of dust. Then Luke's hand settled on a box that seemed newer than the rest. It was a small wooden crate, sealed shut with yellow tape. Inside, wrapped in cloth, rested a single framed photograph. He froze. The picture captured two men in uniform standing before a Humvee, their faces younger, both smiling into the blinding desert sun. One was undeniably Thomas. Clean-shaven, his eyes brighter, his shoulders held straighter. The other man was someone Luke knew instantly, even though he hadn't seen that face in over a decade. It was his brother, Evan Tanner. Luke's breath hitched. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly. Thomas turned, startled by the sudden coldness in his voice. When his eyes fell on the photo in Luke's hands, all color drained from his face. For a moment, the only sound was the wind mourning through the boards. "You know him," Thomas finally breathed. "He's my brother," Luke said, his voice dangerously low. "Evan Tanner. He went missing near Mosul 10 years ago. We never found a body, only reports. No closure." His grip on the frame turned his knuckles white. "He served with you, didn't he?" Thomas's jaw clenched, his eyes immediately dropping to the ground, the lines in his face deepening. "Yeah," he said finally. "He did." Luke's heart thundered in his chest. "What happened?" Thomas took a long, unsteady breath, his hands trembling slightly. "That's not a story I've told in a long time," he said. "And maybe not one you want to hear." Luke stepped closer. "Try me." But Thomas gave no answer. Instead, he reached out and carefully took the photograph back, his eyes lingering on it as though the younger man might still speak from within the frame. "Some ghosts," he said quietly. "They never really rest. And some truths aren't meant for only one man." Luke stood there, caught in a torrent of anger and confusion, as the wind rose to a howl outside. Echo whined softly at his feet, and Scout nudged Thomas's boot, sensing the crushing weight in the air. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The light through the small window dimmed the silver day, giving way to the gray of evening. Thomas finally looked up, his voice cutting the silence like the first crack on thin ice. "I think," he said, his eyes distant, "the Lord has a strange sense of timing. I buried that photograph a long, long time ago. I never thought it would find its way home." The quiet that followed felt far too big for the small room. Outside, snow began to fall again. It was soft, slow, as if the sky itself had paused to listen. Inside the cabin, a secret, long buried, had risen to the surface, and in its shadow both men knew the peace of that morning was gone forever. The fire had burned low when Thomas finally spoke again. The air in the cabin felt thick, heavy with unspoken history. Outside, the snow pressed against the windows, a soft yet relentless siege. Luke sat at the table. The photograph still lay between them. The faces in it, his brother Evan's and a younger Thomas, seemed frozen in time, untouched by the storm that now raged beyond the walls. "You owe me the truth," Luke said at last, his voice flat, but with a tremor. Thomas's weathered hands clenched the table's edge. His eyes, usually so calm, flickered with a deep and familiar pain. "You're right," he said quietly. "You deserve to hear it." He finally leaned back, a heavy sigh. "Mosul. 10 years back. Evan Tanner served under me. Our orders were to lock down an old industrial complex. Just a routine mission, or so the brass claimed. But that day, nothing was routine." Thomas's voice, low and steady, felt heavy with regret. "We walked right into an ambush. There were dozens of them, concealed in the rubble. I can still hear it. First steel grinding on stone, then the deafening rifle fire. We lost 3 men instantly. Your brother, Evan, he was the kid of the group. Brilliant, sharp as a tack. He had a safe spot back on communications, but he chose to cover our 6. Luke's jaw clenched. He stayed behind. Thomas gave a slow, somber nod. He dragged me clear just as the explosion hit. I took the brunt of it, went dark for a moment. When I awoke, the building was collapsing, and he was still inside. He paused, staring deep into the fire. I tried to get back to him. I swear to God I did, but the floor gave way before I could get close. The fire danced in his eyes as he spoke, making them glisten like unshed tears. I called for evac, but by the time help arrived, it was all just rubble and smoke. The official report said no survivors, but I never accepted that he was just gone. Even now in my dreams, I hear him yelling my name. Luke's fingertips traced the worn edge of the photo. The picture blurred for a moment beneath his touch. And you just told no one. Thomas shook his head slowly. Nobody ever asked. The file was stamped, "Mission Failure." I brought that burden home with me, burying it deep beneath work and silence. Then Sarah fell ill, and I just gave up trying to understand what life was taking from me. His voice fractured for a second on her name. When she passed, I retreated here, decided the world had already taken everything it was going to take from me, and it was time to stop faking that I had anything left to offer. Luke suddenly pushed himself to his feet. The leg of his chair screamed against the floorboards. He walked to the window, glaring into the blackness beyond. The fire's reflection danced weakly in the pane next to his face. "You made it back," he said, his voice low. "Because my brother didn't." Thomas offered no reply. There were no words that could ever fix this. Luke turned his face pale and rigid. My mother waited for years, for a call that never ever came. I told her he might still be alive out there, captured or lost. I told her she had to keep hoping. His voice finally broke. "You could have just told us the truth." Thomas's shoulders slumped, as if decades of guilt had finally stolen his breath. "I couldn't face her," he whispered. "I couldn't face any of you. The kind of guilt that never ends. It just eats you alive, piece by piece." Silence descended again, shattered only by the hiss and pop of the flames. Luke finally turned, striding for the door. Both Echo and Scout raised their heads, their loyal eyes tracking his every move. "Where are you going?" Thomas asked. "Out," Luke replied flatly, grabbing his coat. "I need some air." Thomas started to rise, but Luke shook his head once. "Don't." He then gently picked up the 2 puppies, tucking them inside a blanket before stepping out into the raging storm. The door clicked shut, the wind instantly devouring the sound of his footsteps. Thomas stood motionless for a long moment, staring at nothing but the empty doorway. The fire cracked a single sharp sound that flung sparks into the gloom before collapsing into glowing embers. He dragged both hands down his weary face. The ensuing silence was a crushing weight. He reached for his oil lamp, his hands shaking as he struck a match to light the wick. Its glow was fragile and unsteady, a trembling light that mirrored his own ragged breath. He shrugged into his heavy coat and stepped out into the crushing cold of the night. The air hit him like a fist, though the wind had finally calmed. Yet the snow still fell in a thick, silent curtain, glittering in the lantern's reach. The forest loomed before him, a vast and quiet darkness. "Luke!" he called out, his voice stolen by the trees. The only answer was the sigh of the wind. He tried again, desperate. "Luke!" Then softer, a whisper for a ghost. "Evan?" He plunged forward, his boots sinking into the deep drifts, each step a struggle against the weight. But he pushed onward, following the faintest trail before it was lost to the woods. His mind began to slip backward in time. Images of Mosul burned behind his eyelids. The sharp smell of smoke, the high-pitched ringing in his ears, Evan's voice shouting through the chaos, and then the awful silence that followed. He stumbled, catching his balance on a snow-heavy branch, the past tripping him in the present. The lantern flame guttered, threatening to die. "You saved my life," he murmured the words, a confession to the unhearing wind. and I've done nothing but run from it ever since. After what felt like an hour, he saw it, a subtle movement, a dark shape beneath a pine. He raised the lamp higher, its light falling upon Luke, who sat on a fallen log with a dusting of snow gathering on his shoulders. In his arms, he cradled the puppies, their fur frosted with ice crystals. Thomas approached with careful, deliberate steps. "You'll freeze to death out here," he said softly. Luke didn't look up, but his voice was steady, though hollow. "He looked just like you." "In the photo," he said. "Younger, but he had your eyes. I used to think if I ever found the man who was with him that day, I'd hate him. But now, I don't know what to feel." Thomas halted a few feet away, the lantern light flickering in the space between them. "I've hated myself enough for the both of us," he said, his voice thick with unshed grief. "If that means anything." At that, Luke finally looked up, the fire of his anger now banked. In its place was something quieter, a deep sorrow that was hard to name. "Maybe that's the problem," he said. "You've been punishing yourself for so long you forgot how to live." A cloud of white formed as Thomas exhaled into the cold. He nodded slowly. "And maybe you've been running so long you've forgotten what home even feels like." They stood in a fragile truce, the wind whispering secrets through the trees. Scout whimpered softly, nestled in Luke's arms. Echo gently licked his chin, a simple grounding reminder of warmth. Thomas reached out a gloved hand. "Come on, son," he said. "Let's get them inside. The fire's still burning." Luke hesitated for only a second, then nodded. Together they turned back towards the cabin. Their shadows stretched long against the snow, the lantern swinging between them, a single point of light in the heart of the storm. When they reached the porch, Thomas paused, his gaze fixed on the two shivering pups in Luke's arms. "You know," he said quietly, "sometimes surviving isn't about being strong. It's about remembering the ones who didn't make it." Luke held his gaze. "Then maybe that's what we're both doing," he replied, "trying to live for him." Inside, the fire greeted them with a soft, crackling warmth. No more words were spoken that night. Thomas just fed the flames. Luke gently toweled the puppies dry, and the cabin settled back into the soft, steady pulse of survival. Two men, each bearing their own ghosts, were slowly discovering what forgiveness truly was: not a simple gift, but a weight to be carried together. Outside, the endless snow continued its descent. But inside, the quietness between them was no longer a void. The following morning broke with a gentleness unseen before. The blanket of snow had started to recede, leaving the pines to weep silver tears that caught the faint morning light. Mist ghosted over the frozen creek near the cabin, and the air held the damp, earthy scent of a storm finally breaking. Luke stood outside, his hands shoved into his pockets, gazing as Scout and Echo joyfully stumbled through the melting snow, chasing one another in a clumsy dance across the clearing. Their excited yelps echoed in the silent woods, pulling a slight, reluctant smile to his lips. Behind him, the cabin door groaned open. Thomas emerged, shrugging into a thick flannel jacket over his sweater. The man's frame was as solid as ever, but a new, softer grace had found its way into his movements. "Roads should be clear enough by noon," he said, squinting down the narrow track that snaked down the mountainside. "We'll make a run to Cold Creek for supplies. Could do with a new radio, and I figure that truck of yours needs some parts before it's anything more than a monument to the snow." Luke gave a slow nod. "Sounds like a plan. I can get the gas, assuming there's any to be had in that town." Thomas let out an amused grunt. "Cold Creek's the kind of place where a good word still goes further than cash. Just keep your manners about you and your money in your pocket." By the time midday arrived, they had loaded the bed of Thomas's old red pickup with empty gas cans and a couple of lists scrawled on scrap paper. Scout and Echo claimed the back seat. Their wet noses were pressed against the cold glass, fogging it with each warm breath. The road coiled down through the trees, the snowpack shrinking the further they descended. Luke stared out as the forest became a blur, his mind a world away. Cold Creek was little more than a whisper of a town, a single main street with weathered wooden storefronts and faded signs. The American flag outside the post office hung limp, stirring faintly in the biting wind. A handful of townspeople glanced up as the crimson truck rumbled into view, their faces a careful mixture of curiosity and bone-deep weariness. In a place this still a stranger was an event. They arrived with the rarity of a storm, and everyone paid attention. Thomas pulled up before a hardware store with a sign that read, "Keller Supply and Fix It." The moment Luke stepped onto the street, he felt the weight of their stares. A knot of old-timers on a bench outside the barbershop fell silent, their eyes tracking from his military-style jacket to the two dogs whose tails were beating a happy rhythm against his legs. "Friendly bunch," Luke murmured. Thomas smirked. "Don't take it to heart. The last strangers through here were collecting for the government." Inside the store, the air was thick with the smell of machine oil and fresh-cut wood. A man in his 70s was minding the counter, his suspenders straining over a plaid shirt, his silver hair a wild mess. "Morning, Tom," he called out, his voice a blend of genuine surprise and familiar warmth. "Didn't figure we'd see you down the mountain so soon after that blizzard. Couldn't stay snowbound forever, Hank." Thomas answered, his hand landing warmly on his shoulder. "We need some plugs of belt for the generator and that old tire jack if you haven't gotten rid of it." Hank Keller's sharp gaze fell on Luke, his eyes narrowing. "New friend Luke Tanner," Thomas interjected quickly. "He's just passing through. His truck broke down near my ridge." Hank nodded slowly. "Good to meet you, son. There's always room for another hard worker here, but just steer clear of Sheriff Rudd. He keeps an eye on strangers." He chuckled, moving to fetch the parts. As they stepped back out onto the street, the rich scent of coffee hung in the air. Across the road, a small sign swayed in the wind, Martha's Cafe. Warm meals. Honest prices. Thomas's entire expression softened. "Haven't been in there for a long while," he murmured softly. Luke followed his gaze to the cafe. "An old friend." "Something like that," Thomas replied, sighing. "Come on, she makes the best pie this side of the Rockies." A bell above the cafe door chimed softly when they entered. The place was small, but felt incredibly cozy. It was filled with a radio's low hum and the aroma of cinnamon and fresh roasted coffee beans. Behind the counter was a woman in her early 60s, surprisingly tall and graceful. Her silver-streaked auburn hair tied in a loose bun. Her skin was fair, her features both gentle and alert, and her eyes held the color of sunlit lake water. They carried both a deep kindness and the heavy weight of loss. Seeing Thomas, her face lit with surprise and raw emotion. "Well, I'll be," she breathed, placing the coffee pot on the counter. "Thomas Reed." "I thought the forest finally swallowed you whole." Thomas offered a faint smile. "It would have, if not for him and two loud dogs." She let out a soft, genuine laugh. "Still out there rescuing people, I see." She poured coffee into 2 fresh mugs, then gestured to a window booth. "Sit down. You both look like you're running on frostbite and regrets." A smile touched Luke's lips as he slid into the booth, the cafe's warmth seeping deep into his bones. Martha Jenkins moved with a quiet, calm efficiency. She brought them pie and refilled their mugs without a word. There was a quiet grace about her, a woman who carried her sorrow without letting it harden her soul. After a moment, she sat with them, studying Luke with a curious gaze. "You have the look of a soldier," she observed. "Eyes that have seen too much but are still looking for something to fix." Luke chuckled softly. "A retired Navy SEAL. I guess that look doesn't wash off easy." Her expression softened. "No, son, it doesn't. My husband was the very same way." She turned her eyes to Thomas. "You remember my Paul Jenkins, don't you?" Thomas nodded slowly. "He's hard to forget." He saved half our convoy that day outside of Basra, and you—" He hesitated, his voice dropping low. "You wrote letters to every one of us afterward." "I still have mine." Martha offered a wistful smile. "He always spoke so highly of you, Thomas. He said you were the kind of man who would carry others on his back when the world fell apart." Her eyes glistened for a moment before she blinked the moisture away. "He's gone. His heart gave out 3 winters ago. I just keep this place running to have something to do. Yeah, and because men like you still need a warm place to sit." For a moment only the soft scraping of forks against plates filled the silence. Then Martha reached under the counter, unfolding a map, etched with age. "You said your truck's up by the ridge, right?" Thomas nodded. "An old training camp used to be near there," she said, her finger tracing the deep creases. "Old K9 program, military dogs, their handlers, the works. My nephew used to make supply runs there. It's been abandoned for years, but you might find some gear fuel or even some tools. It's marked right here." She circled a spot deep within the woods. "Call it a gut feeling, but I think you'll find something you weren't aware you were looking for." Thomas met her gaze with quiet gratitude. "You still have that uncanny way of knowing things before they unfold." Martha laughed softly. "It's a gift of age and heartbreak." They finished the meal and gave her their thanks. She pressed a thermos of hot coffee into Luke's hands as they left. "For the road," she said, "and tell those dogs they are welcome here anytime." Echo's tail wagged as if he understood her. As they drove toward the mountains, the town dissolved into the snowy haze behind them. Luke unfolded the worn map on his lap, tracing the red circle Martha drew. "This old training camp, my brother, he might have been there," he said softly. Thomas kept his eyes locked on the road. "Then we'll go," he said simply. "Maybe it's time we both finally stopped running from our pasts." The truck climbed steadily into the dense mist, its engine sound mingling with wind rustling through the thawing branches, like a solemn promise that something long buried was now waiting to be found. The next morning dawned clear and cold. A sky of pale blue stretched out endlessly above the white ridges. Their red truck rumbled along a forgotten service road, its tires crunching over the frozen gravel. Luke sat silently in the passenger seat. The worn map from Martha was folded on his lap. Scout and Echo were nestled together in a blanket right behind them, their small heads peeking over the seat as the forest rushed by in streaks of deep pine and white frost. The route was rough, the trail narrowing until the trees themselves seemed to lean in, as if guarding the secrets that waited ahead. Thomas kept one hand firm upon the wheel, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. His weathered face caught the light, a mask of creased lines and gray stubble, and eyes that looked as if they'd stared down both sandstorms and snow squalls without flinching. "We have to be close now," he said. "Old Echo Base, it sits between 2 ridges. The army shut it down right after. The last handler finally retired. Some say they just left it all to rot." Luke glanced out the window. "Funny name," he said. "Echo Base." Thomas offered a faint smile. Every unit that ever trained there said the same thing. They claimed you could still hear the dogs barking long after they were gone. The road ended at a pair of rusted iron gates, one half fallen off its hinges. Above them, a weathered sign hung its paint nearly invisible beneath layers of snow and rust. U.S. Army K9 Training Division Cold Creek Detachment. A torn American flag clung defiantly to its pole, frayed but still recognizable. The silence surrounding the place was vast. They climbed from the truck. The air, thin and sharp, carried the sound of branches groaning beneath melting ice. Scout immediately bounded forward, his nose to the ground, tail wagging. Echo followed more cautiously, sniffing the snow, his ears alert. Luke traced his hand along the gate, feeling the cold sting of the iron. "Feels strange," he murmured, "like stepping into a memory that isn't yours." Thomas nodded. "Maybe it belongs to us both." The base sprawled across a wide clearing, a few long, low buildings that were sagging from years of neglect.